There is a recurring architecture in human systems of power. It does not disappear across eras. It retools itself, changing its language, its symbols, and its categories while preserving its core function: to organize who absorbs pressure and who accumulates power. In medieval Europe, that architecture was visible and unapologetic. Society was structured through a vertical logic, lords and serfs, bound not only by economics, but by cosmology. The architecture of hierarchy was justified through what might be called divine proximity. Kings ruled by the will of God, nobles by inherited right, and peasants labored within a system presented as natural necessity and ordained by the divine. The serf was not described as biologically inferior. Instead, he was framed as structurally subordinate, tied to land, limited in mobility, governed by obligation rather than autonomy. The justification was not "you are lesser by nature," but rather, "this is your place in the order of things." This distinction matters. The boundary was rigid, but not absolute. Identity, while constrained, was not yet fully encoded as destiny. The enslavement of Slavic populations represented an important transitional moment. It was here that a subtle but powerful shift occurred. A people became synonymous with a condition. The very word slave derives from Slav. At this stage, the logic of hierarchy had not yet hardened into racial ideology. Slavs were often described as pagan, fragmented, outside imperial or Christian order. Their enslavement was justified through distance from the dominant system, not permanent biological inferiority. Yet, something crucial was forming. When a group is constantly and consistently positioned as outside protection, it becomes easier to position them as available for extraction. This is the bridge between feudal hierarchy and something more scalable. As European powers expanded into Africa and the Americas, the existing feudal logic encountered a limitation. It did not scale well across continent. You could not easily maintain control over distant populations using only local allegiances, land ties, and religious assimilation. A new system was required, one that could operate across vast distances, justify permanent labor extraction, reproduce itself across generations, reduce the need for continuous coercive explanation. This is where race enters, not as the origin of hierarchy, but as an optimization of it. The Atlantic slave system introduced a critical upgrade. Identity became fixed, inherited, and biologically justified. Where feudal systems said, "you are in this position," racial systems said, "you are this position." The language shifted accordingly, from disorder to inferiority, from outside the system to naturally beneath it, from convertible identity to permanent classification. This was not just prejudice, it was infrastructure. One of these consequential developments in this period was the construction of whiteness as a shared identity. In feudal Europe, poor Europeans had little structural alignment with elites. They were subject of the same extraction system, differentiated mainly by degree. But in colonial systems, a new dynamic emerged. A broad category of white identity was created. This identity provided relative privilege, even for the poor. It functioned as a buffer layer between elites and enslaved population. This did several things simultaneously. Reduced the risk of unification rebellion by aligning poor Europeans with elite identity rather than shared economic condition. Distributed enforcement, lower status white often became intermediaries in maintaining the system. Stabilized hierarchy through psychological investment in identity rather than material equality. This is not to say poor Europeans were no longer exploited. They were, but they were now positioned differently within the system. Not at the top, but no longer at the absolute bottom. Not fully empowered, but partially aligned. This alignment became one of the most effective social stabilizer systems of extraction had created. From structural perspective, racism can be understood not as a sudden invention, but as a repackaging and hardening of older hierarchical logic that Europeans used to live under. The core strategies remain consistent. Define difference, assign meaning to that difference, build systems that reinforce that meaning, normalize the outcome as natural or necessary. What changed is the justification layer. In feudal era, it was divine order. In early empires, it was civilizational difference and superiority. In racial and colorism systems, it is biological hierarchy. In modern systems, it is colonial and post-colonial statistical and economic language. It will be too simple to say that racism is merely a direct continuation of feudalistic language and psychosis, or that one group replaced another in a linear chain. But in fact, history is more layered than that. Systems of dominance and extraction consistently seek stable ways to organize and maintain inequality for the sake of its own survival. When one justification becomes unstable, another is engineered swiftly. From divine right, to racial pseudoscience to algorithmic scoring, the language evolves. The structure often adapts faster than the values that challenge it. So, the question is not only historical but present. When such a system no longer declares itself openly, how do you recognize it when it speaks in numbers and mutated language?